In 1955, an African-American teenager named Emmett Louis Till allegedly flirted with a white store clerk on a trip to stay with his great-uncle Moses and his other relatives. Only days after this occurrence, his mutilated dead body was found floating in the Tallahatchie River. His assailants were found not guilty in court. During this time period, racial segregation and Jim Crow laws, state and local laws that legalized segregation, established ways to enforce economic disparity, lessen voting rights, and many other methods of disadvantaging black people. On top of this, widespread racism and bias against black communities meant that white people could often get away with the lynching and blatant murder of blacks. However, throughout the course of the early 1950s to the late 1960s was sparked a series of civil rights movements and protests which would confront and work to change these issues. One of the most influential civil rights activists of the time was Martin Luther King Jr. In the April of 1963, King traveled to Birmingham, Alabama in order to continue his protest against the segregational policies of the time. However, with declining support for the movement, a powerful stand had to be made in order to succeed. One idea, brought up by Reverend Bevel, was to teach the children of Birmingham to protest alongside them. King, deciding it morally wrong to involve the children, quickly shot down the idea. The children, however, given the dire circumstances and the opportunity for a substantial victory, took it upon themselves to peacefully protest for the cause of their rights and directly created a path towards a diplomatic resolution. On December 1, 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks was arrested when she refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white commuter, and thereby breaking the segregational laws in place. Inspired by this, Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists aided in the protesting of segregation on buses in a movement known as the bus boycott. King and other pastors were reached in order to help spread word of the imminent movement to the black communities in hopes that they would take action and boycott the bus system. On December 5th, the planned day of the boycott, King watched from his window, mind racing over whether or not the movement would be a success. To his astonishment, about 90% of the local African Americans had stayed off of buses that day. The same day, a meeting took place between the church ministers and other leaders over discussing the possibility of turning the boycott into a long-term protest. During the meeting, the Montgomery Improvement Association was founded with King elected as president. The bus boycott would continue for 381 days, lasting through many hardships until December 21, 1956, when the Montgomery bus system started to integrate decisions made by the Supreme Court deeming it unconstitutional to enforce any type of racially segregated seating on buses. The South Christian Leadership Conference was formed in 1957, stemming from the Montgomery Improvement Association, which had recently changed the state of Montgomery's segregated bus system. It functioned as an organization in which activists could better organize and act upon rallies, boycotts, marches, and other forms of peaceful protest throughout the southern states. The SCLC was founded in King's own home city of Atlanta, Georgia, and soon found itself at the forefront of civil rights movements along with the NAACP and other major organizations. In 1961, King and activists of the SCLC joined forces with groups and other organizations and brought national recognition to a campaign in Albany, Georgia, to end all forms of segregation in the city. Unfortunately, the campaign may have been too ambitious for its own good. It began when members of the SNCC traveled to Albany, Georgia, to encourage the public to take action against the Jim Crow-era policies. The organization conducted many different forms of protest. They conducted sit-ins, a form of protest where black citizens would refuse to move from white-only spaces in order to promote change in the system. They, in cooperation with other organizations, also inspired and organized boycotts, jail-ins, and other forms of protest. Despite all of this, the Albany movement would ultimately result in a failure. Police Chief Laurie Pritchett countered the nonviolent protests by refraining from violence himself. He ordered and conducted mass arrests but avoided brutality, which would serve to not draw negative attention to the situation. Soon after arriving in Albany, King and many other advocates were jailed under charges of parading without a permit. A few months later, King again found himself jailed. Following yet another arrest on July 17, 1962, King announced he would depart from Albany, effectively ending the movement. In the April of 1963, King and the SCLC traveled to Birmingham, Alabama to join in and support the civil rights movement ongoing in the city. The campaign took off to a strong start consisting of sit-ins, boycotts, and other forms of nonviolent protest that mainly targeted the economic aspects of the city. Only about a week after initializing the campaign, the city acquired a court injunction, making it unlawful for the protest to continue. On April 12, King was arrested by virtue of the court injunction and was put into a county jail. From that jail, King wrote his now famous letter from Birmingham jail, dispelling criticism of the movement and displaying that his methods were not a lack of diplomacy and negotiation, but instead were a path to them. On April 20th, bail money was made and King was released from prison. Throughout the latter half of April, the amount of volunteers willing to go to jail for the movement started to dwindle, making it clear that no ideas were needed in order to sustain the movement. Reverend Bevel, an activist who worked alongside King in the SCLC, suggested that they teach the children of Birmingham how to protest alongside them, hopefully allowing the movement to continue in a new and reinvigorated light. King initially felt it wrong to involve the children of Birmingham, seeing as they would be put into serious danger with the police and notoriously brutal Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor. Despite King's aversion to the strategy, Bevel and other members of the SCLC pressed on with the plan, believing it could be the movement's saving grace.
Well, in terms of the nature of the situation, because of the intense suppression and the conditioning of the adults, it was necessary to use children, because children had not been indoctrinated into that kind of violence and suppression.
On the 2nd of May, Bevel's plan finally saw its debut as over 1,000 African-American students ditched school to march down the streets of Birmingham, many of them arrested and taken to jail. Many of the protesting students marched peacefully down the streets while they performed sit-ins, and some of the youngest went to the libraries where they simply read books. The first day of the children's marching was extremely effective and gave the movement a new hope at succeeding. However, King's worry would soon come to fruition as Bull Connor ordered police and firemen towards actions contrary to what the Albany police did in order to achieve their victory over the protesters. On the 3rd of May, Bull ordered the firemen of the city to aim their high-powered hoses meant for drenching entire buildings straight into the crowds of children. Those hoses were powerful enough to hospitalize Fred Shuttleworth, a member of the SCLC, while he was leading a crowd of children through the streets of Birmingham. Bull also ordered the police officers to release dogs in order to chase the children down. Some of the protesters, in response to the police actions, hurled bricks and stones at the police, but the majority of them stayed peaceful. The police continued arrests in full force, taking as many of the protesters as possible. All the while, images of the brutality taking place at Birmingham were being taken and spread across the nation. Television broadcasts showed dogs chasing and biting children, firemen shooting down crowds upon crowds with their hoses, and police with their batons raised pinning down school-aged children. These broadcasts, images, and descriptions of what was taking place at Birmingham were seen all throughout the nation and began to open the door for a diplomatic ending at Birmingham. The nation was outraged upon seeing the events taking place in Birmingham, Alabama, and eagerly waited to see how the White House would respond. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent his assistant Burke Marshall to Birmingham in order to negotiate with King in an attempt to reach an agreeable solution between the protesters, the city, and the business owners in the community. A short-term solution was soon suggested by business owners and representatives of the city in hopes of relieving some of the pressure they felt by the boycotts and protests. They wished for the demonstrations to halt and for the boycotts to be lifted in exchange for giving in to a portion of the demands of the protesters. On May 8th, King informed negotiators that protests and demonstrations would cease for the period of negotiations. This decision was extremely controversial between black communities and even between King's fellow leaders, believing that keeping up pressure upon the businesses was the correct way to proceed. On May 10th, a satisfactory agreement was reached. This agreement, known as the Birmingham Truce Agreement, called for the desegregation of lunch counters, desegregation of public facilities, removal of racially separating signs, and a multitude of other compromises which would further serve the cause of racial equality. The agreement was a major victory for the people of Birmingham, but the movement would soon become the cause of a much greater success than just localized concessions. On June 11, 1963, President John F. Kennedy released a televised address to the nation regarding civil rights, showing his support for the movement and announcing he would introduce a comprehensive civil rights bill into Congress. In the months after the success of Birmingham, with support for the movement at an all-time high, and the president himself proclaiming his support, it seemed an opportune time for a victory far greater than just individual desegregation to be achieved. On August 28th, one of the largest displays of civil rights ever in history would take place, as an estimated 250,000 people gathered at Lincoln Memorial to hear from notable leaders speak about civil rights and urge Congress to pass a bill which would work to get rid of segregation, protect voting rights, and finally reach the long-awaited goal of equal rights. Although the movement would later incite the passage of multiple laws, the march was seen by many activists as unwise, and even though President John F. Kennedy himself endorsed the march, he initially had many worries that it would end in violence. The massive event ended with a speech from Martin Luther King Jr. himself.
Of freedom and justice, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
He would not have to wait long for his dream to become reality. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson passed a Civil Rights Act which prohibited discrimination based upon race, color, sex, and nationality in most aspects of life. A year later, on August 6th, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, banning the use of literacy tests and other forms of black voter suppression.
We said back there that really only God, only the books in heaven can know how many Negroes have come up missing and dead and killed under the system in which we lived. I think only God's book can show that.
At quite possibly one of the lowest points in the civil rights movement, it may have ended in failure were it not for the thousands of children in Birmingham who carved the way for a diplomatic ending to the intense struggles millions had faced before them. If not for the brave children in Birmingham, who knows how different our world today could look.